Hi guys. So now we're gonna get into the little lecture, not very long, about Monique Wittig. One is not born a woman. So Wittig, she's famous. Just to give you like a very brief biography, she also comes from France or Europe rather. She was born in Danemarie, close to the Rhine, and then she died actually in Tucson, in Arizona, because she was a professor at the University of Arizona, and she's known as one of these important French feminists of kind of the 70s, 80s mostly, up to she died in 2003. So until 20 years ago, she was still pretty active. But she's also known pretty much as a militant lesbian French theorist, right? That's kind of the particular branch of her theory. She was also a writer. She's most famous, I guess, for some of her novels, right? I personally like. I have some of them, but I haven't read them yet. It's something Wittig is something that I discovered recently, the last couple of years. So anyway, we read this essay. One is not born a woman from 1980, and I think it's a great essay to contrast with the Sixou essay, right? The Laugh of the Medusa. Because it's coming from the lesbian perspective and theory, right? But also because it kind of questions, even though agrees in some ways with Sixou's understanding of what it needs to be done in an attempt to go beyond the oppressive system of what we'll call patriarchy in general, right? And Wittig brings kind of not only brings kind of the LGBTQ from especially the lesbian perspective, right? But questions it further and also has some potential disagreement there with Sixou in terms of the feminine, right? And I think what we need to focus sometimes in this essay. I mean, there are many things, but what I believe is very important to focus, right, is that her main point here is that what we have to fight is the myth of woman, right? And especially in terms of how what myths do is that they naturalize things, right? The idea of the man-woman divide as being natural, right, is sustained by this mythical character, right? Like the mythical understood in terms of what doesn't change, right? What is eternal, what is transcendental, what precisely, like to go back to the topic of our class, right? What precisely hinders change, makes it absolutely impossible, right? And that way we can link it a little bit with Sixou when she talks about how also the kind of like male-oriented like kind of writing creates this land of the impossible, right? And while the feminine writing that Sixou is looking for will actually like make this impossible possible, right? Like, but okay, I digress because I know Sixou a little better. But so Wittig is seeing this, right? And he's saying like this is what we need to change. And when she's looking at the feminists in the 60s and 70s, and one of them is Sixou there, she's seeing that in this struggle there is a revalorization of the feminine, right? And she's saying, well, that can be okay-ish as long as we understand the plurality of what women can be, right? And especially coming from the lesbian perspective, as understanding a different kind of woman, right? That is not defined, right, by the dichotomy of man-woman, right? That as a system of oppression, and that's why at the end it's so strong, the call to destroy this system, that this heteronormative, because it's based on the oppression and exploitation of women, and especially of the bodies of women, right? And that's where she gets a lot into questions of birth, right? And something that also Sixou touched a little bit, right? Like the problematic of woman as mother, and how much do you link it or separate it, right? Like how much can you do that? And of course, from the lesbian perspective, the part of not only the ownership of the woman as the slave, this is like the term she uses, right, of man, but also as the the object of desire of man only, right? Like, so in the case of the lesbian point of view, how do you account within this dichotomy for the lesbian desire in general, right? Um, so again, the main point here, and I think the essay is titled "One is not born a woman," right? Pointing out to birth, right? It's against this mythological, naturalized idea of heterosexuality, right? And hetero cultural norms, right? Which is pretty much her point. Like, and that's why she comes from what she calls a materialist feminist approach, right? Materialist in the sense of non-idealist, right? Materialist in the sense of kind of coming from Marxism, even though she does criticize Marxism a lot and for good reasons, right? But in the sense of understanding the social conditions, social and cultural conditions of the development of history as what they are, contingent, right? And not as natural and given, right? Not as eternal, right? Like idealized and so on, right? Um, the other thing that obviously is in the background, and we mentioned this earlier with Cixous, is Simone de Beauvoir, right? Like the famous philosopher and feminist from the 40s and 50s, right? When Wittig quotes her, right? Like when she has this in the second sex, this theory straightforward of like one is not born a woman, right? Like being a woman is not a natural thing, right? But it's a creation, it's a social construction and so on, right? Which of course hits very hard the whole notion of a naturalized world, right? And a naturalized world order that is based on heteronormative, right? That is based on sexual difference, right? That is what is so challenging here. And Wittig is one of the first theorists in France, at least, to question it not only from the feminine side of it or the woman side of it, but from the queer side of it, right? And of course, Wittig will be one of those influential thinkers for people like Judith Butler, right? And the very famous book, Gender Trouble, right? And you might know already about Judith Butler, right? She's one of the best and most important founders of queer theory, right? So yeah, Wittig is in that line, right? So just moving along, I don't want to make this session as long as the one on Cixous. It's a shorter text, right? So to some of the things, right? Like I think, or the points that I believe, and you guys might find other points that are more relevant for you, but I'm just gonna give you the ones that I find more interesting for me, right? So I think one of the main points here is because it's talking about this naturalization that gives a certain not right. It's kind of not only gives a certain right to men of over the bodies of women, right, but to the whole of society, right? Like so, that's when Wittig gets very strong in this mentioning this point of like how giving birth becomes forced production, right? It's a forced production of society, right? Like, and I think this is very, very, as you noticed, and I'm sure you thought about it, this is very relevant when we talk about the cultural wars in the US and we talk about the main point, or one of the main points of contention between conservatism and liberalism in the US, which is abortion, right? And making it legal or illegal, right? Like, because that precisely deals with the reproductive capacities of women, right? And in Wittig's point of view, when that is seen as something that does not belong to the woman, right? Like that is expropriated by the society, right? And the culture, that is the first sign of this manipulation of literally biopolitical manipulation, as we've been talking about in class, right? Of sexual difference in order to make it an essential thing of society, right? And of history, like that is the thing. Like there is this is kind of like a, let's say, manifest destiny of sexual difference, right? The idea that women have to do this, right? And it's something that we, of course, live with a lot these days still, right? It's this, Wittig will probably be still in shock about, I mean, especially since she was here in the US. And maybe that's another reason why she's more conscious about this than than Sixu was. Even though Sixu does teach in the U.S., she never has had like a position like Wittig did for a long time. So that's one thing to think about, and that's also to think it in terms of her own criticism of Marxism, right? The point of Marxism is that in order to, or at least traditional orthodox Marxism, in order to analyze the class struggle, you need to not look at the gender struggle, right? Like the sexual difference struggle, because it's seen by Marxists as a bourgeois kind of thing, right? And a bourgeois in the sense of it has to do with identity, right? And identity within this bourgeois kind of world. And this is very, very important for us, especially that are moving on more into queer theory and beyond heteronormativity, right? Marx and Engels, I will say, in the Communist Manifesto, if you have ever read it, I'm sure some of you have, they do make this point about how the family, as it is conceived, as in traditional terms, is a bourgeois institution, right? And what they're trying to say is that not only the exploitation, and they make this point, and it's pretty good, not only the exploitation of labor, the exploitation of slavery and so on, are linked to the exploitation of women, right? But also that kind of particular exploitation does not work if you are the proletariat, right? Because the division of labor, even though it started happening and really, really growing in the 19th century when Marx and Engels were writing, it doesn't apply in the same way to the proletariat or to the lumpen proletariat, right? Because everybody has to work, right? In some ways. So, but anyway, but Wittig does see this question or this problem of an overlooking of the question of the individual and of the sexual difference through orthodox Marxist analysis, right? And the thing here is that she starts like bringing up that I think is very relevant for us, right? Is how she says, well, we can't have this class consciousness, right? Like as a class struggle without existing as individuals, right? We just can't. Like it is a fight. It is a struggle from both sides. Like you both need to understand the oppression that happens through class divide, and also to understand how that applies to women and LGBTQ people, right? Like how does it apply in terms of what we call the patriarchy, right? Which will be the heteronomical, right? Like the pretty much hierarchical structure that uses these divisions, right? So I think she starts bringing out this idea more and more of we need to have a consciousness of the individual, right? Like a consciousness of the individual beyond these the dualities, right? Beyond the masculine and the feminine, especially beyond men and women, right? And that's the only way of getting out of this and of not only of going beyond and getting rid of the myth of woman, getting rid of the exploitative systems of oppression, right? But also in terms of sexuality, but also in terms of economy, in terms of society and history, right? I think that's kind of one of the main points of the essay that is very, very, very rich, right? And that might be going in a different direction than Sixu. Although, to go back to Sixu a little bit, I think she's not saying something that different, right? Because she's talking about how always the feminine is a plurality and it's a multiplicity, right? I think the discussion with them is not about this desire for a kind of difference that is not oppositional anymore, but that is individualistic in a good sense, right? In the sense of pluralistic, in the sense of like rich in life and different forms and so on, right? I think the main disagreement might happen there, and I will at some point actually need to see if there is there was any discussions between the two. But I think the main point will be that for Sixu, the word feminine allows to do this. Like it still is a rich, because writing has been so contaminated by the patriarchy, if you want to, by the history with the his, right, as in underlined, right, at the possessive masculine adjective, that when the forces of her, right? Open, they will create different possibilities, right? And that's why she mentioned somebody like the gay writer Jean Genet as one great example of feminine writing. For I think Wittig rather coming from the lesbian point of view, questions it better in the sense of, or not better, but like more focused on not everything. We need to get rid of all the stereotypical points of femininity, right? Like, and we gotta be careful with that, especially when some of them are linked to passivity, right? Which is something hard because for other feminists, passivity is something that we have underestimated, and that can be a force rather, right? A force as strong as strength itself, right? So anyway, Vita questions this, of course. So yeah, I think those are kind of some of the points that I wanted to make. Again, I don't want to make this video longer than it is. The text is very rich, and I want for us to focus on 6.2 as well, right? But yeah, I think it is a text that the other thing that I will have to mention really quick is that they both, because they are both French writers, you have to keep in mind that their understanding, and this is for our class, obviously, as it's a literature class, their understanding of the role of language in this struggle, in the struggle for LGBTQ or women's rights, is the understanding of the role of language is very important because Romance languages like French are more genderized than English, right? Like you have to keep that in mind. Like in French, we don't have a neutral pronoun, subject pronoun like it, right? So every time you need, this is just a silly example, right? Every time you need a neutral pronoun, so to say, it is time, right? It is time. You have to say, you have to use a masculine, right? You have to say, il est temps de faire quelque chose, right? Every time there is, for example, in French, right, is il y a. It carries always the masculine subject pronoun, right? Like the equivalent of he for us, right? And that's how the whole language is based, right? So every time there is a default, right? Like for a group of people, if it includes, if it's only female, it will have a female ending, the adjective or noun, right? But if it's male and women, it will have always the masculine, like the default will be the masculine, right? So when you're a writer, a philosopher, in this language, right, you are always dealing with that, right? Like you're always dealing, and we talked about how learning a language changes your worldview, right? So growing up with a language that is genderized, right? And when you are writing, right, when you're reading, affects you and makes you realize how genderized everything is, right? And how radical the change needs to be, right? Because at the end of the day, both 6.2 and Wittig are pointing out, because it's not a matter of like idealistic values or naturalistic values, but rather cultural and social, like everything is possible. We can change it, right? Like that's why we struggle to allow other pronouns, right? Like when we talk about different sexual identities, like the idea of, some people complain like, oh, it's just not natural to use they. It's like, it's not, there's nothing natural in language, right? Like we can change it and we can do it. It's just a matter of practice, right? Like, and as a language professor, I can tell you, it is. That's how you learn a language. You learn to use different words and different codes and different structures to name the world, right? So anyway, that's my little, even the phone fell. That's my little mini lecture on Wittig. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope I didn't ramble too much. And yeah, I'm looking forward to our discussion tomorrow of both texts. So, and I ended up not looking at the camera like I do. Okay, so have a good day, guys. Stay safe and talk to you tomorrow.